The conference room blazed with bright lights. CEO Clara Voss walked past a line of employees during an emergency meeting. On the floor, a man in a janitor's uniform was wiping up spilled coffee. She glanced at him and laughed. "Someone like you wants to contribute to this meeting?" He looked up, calm. "Sometimes the person cleaning the floor sees things the people standing above can't." The whole room laughed loudly. She replied, mocking, "You're just a janitor, not a strategic consultant." He nodded. "Perhaps, but tomorrow I'll need to speak with you as the new shareholder." She froze, thinking he was joking. But the next day, financial news reported, VossTech Corporation acquired by Ward Holdings. Ethan Ward, 38 years old, former entrepreneur, now a single father working as a janitor. Clara Voss, 33 years old, cold CEO, known for being sharp but arrogant. Lily Ward, 7 years old, his daughter, intelligent, loved drawing dreams about daddy's house. 3 years ago, Ethan lost everything. His company was betrayed by a partner. His wife left, leaving him with his young daughter. He hid his identity and applied to work as a janitor at VossTech Corporation, the very company that had acquired his failed business. He wanted to understand how they operated and secretly accumulated shares through small shell companies. Every morning, he arrived early, mopping the 28th floor where CEO Clara worked. She never looked at him for more than 3 seconds. One day he saw her crying in the elevator while reading an email about laying off 40 employees. He said softly, "The strongest person is the one who dares to say sorry." She glared. "Are you lecturing me?" "No, I just used to be like you." She walked away, leaving him with sad eyes. This woman didn't know her company was collapsing due to the same mistake he'd made years ago. But Ethan's story went deeper than simple revenge or justice. 3 years ago, when his company collapsed, it hadn't just been about money. 230 employees had lost their jobs overnight. Families had their savings wiped out. One of his senior engineers had a heart attack from the stress. Another had committed suicide, leaving behind a wife and 3 children. Ethan had attended that funeral, had looked into those children's eyes, had carried guilt heavier than any bankruptcy filing. VossTech had swooped in during the collapse, bought his patents for pennies on the dollar, then resold the technology for millions. They had made a fortune off his failure, off his employees' suffering. He'd wanted revenge then, had planned elaborate schemes to destroy them. But Lily had changed everything. One night, she'd found him drunk and crying, staring at legal documents. She'd climbed into his lap, all of 5 years old, and said, "Daddy, why are you sad?" "Because Daddy made mistakes and people got hurt." "Can you fix it?" "I don't know, baby." "Then try. That's what you always tell me. Try." So instead of destroying VossTech, he'd decided to infiltrate it, learn it, understand how they'd succeeded where he'd failed, and maybe, just maybe, use that knowledge to build something better. The janitor job had been strategic. It gave him access to every floor, every conversation, every careless document left on desks after hours. He'd learned more about VossTech in 6 months of cleaning than most executives learned in years. And he'd started buying shares, carefully, through multiple LLCs and investment vehicles. Never enough to trigger disclosure requirements. Just patient, methodical accumulation. Clara Voss had no idea that the man mopping her floor was the same person slowly taking control of her company. Every morning she walked past him without seeing him, just like she walked past the security guard, the receptionist, the maintenance crew. To her, they were furniture, necessary but invisible. One afternoon, he overheard her on a call with the board. They were pressuring her to make deeper cuts, to sacrifice more employees to protect shareholder value. "I don't have a choice," she'd said, her voice cracking slightly. "It's them or the company." Ethan had paused his mopping. For a moment, he'd almost felt sympathy. She was trapped in the same system that had destroyed him, making impossible choices, carrying impossible weight. But then she'd spotted him listening and snapped, "Don't you have floors to clean?" The sympathy had evaporated. A week later, during a company-wide meeting about restructuring, someone had asked about employee welfare programs. Clara had dismissed it coldly. We're not a charity. We're a business. People who can't add value don't deserve to stay. Ethan had been wiping down tables in the back of the room. He'd stopped, looked at her, and said quietly, "That's what I used to think too. Right before I lost everything that mattered." She'd laughed. The whole room had laughed with her. "You're just a janitor. What would you know about running a company?" He'd smiled, sad and knowing. "More than you think." That was the moment he decided to accelerate his plan, not out of anger, out of necessity, because this company was heading toward the same cliff he'd gone over. And when it fell, it would take hundreds of innocent people with it, unless someone stopped it. A cleaning staff member later said, "He never complained, just smiled while mopping. Everyone said he was different, polite like someone who'd once been at the top." VossTech was on the verge of bankruptcy due to wrong investment directions. Clara still acted strong, rejecting acquisition offers from Ward Holdings, an anonymous conglomerate in the market. One evening, she walked through the technical floor and heard the janitor reading a financial report. "You understand these things?" "I read because I want to know where my company is collapsing. You sound like a CFO." "I used to be." She laughed loudly. "Right, CFO of the mop company." He didn't respond, just asked, "Have you ever failed?" "No, I don't allow it." "Then you haven't really lived yet." The next day, she made the decision to sell a risky technology division, not knowing the buyer was Ethan, under a different company name. He was completing the acquisition of all of VossTech. When the contract was finalized, he still silently went to work as usual. On the day of the announcement meeting, Clara suddenly received notification. Ward Holdings now owns 78% of shares. Her face went pale. And the person who entered the boardroom that day was the janitor she'd once humiliated. But the revelation was more complex than a simple gotcha moment. When Ethan walked into that boardroom, he didn't gloat, didn't smile triumphantly. He just looked tired. Clara stared at him, her brain trying to process what was happening. "This is impossible. You're the janitor." "I'm also Ethan Ward, former CEO of Ward Technologies, the company your predecessor bought and dismantled 3 years ago." The room went silent. Some board members remembered that acquisition. It had been brutal, efficient, profitable. "You've been planning this," Clara said, not a question, an accusation. "I've been surviving. Planning came later." One of the board members, an older man named Robert, leaned forward. "Mr. Ward, what are your intentions? Are you here to liquidate? To take revenge?" "I'm here to fix what's broken, starting with the leadership philosophy that values profit over people." Clara's face flushed. "That's business. That's how companies survive." "No, that's how companies die slowly while looking successful. I know because I did the same thing, made the same choices, sacrificed people for numbers, and it destroyed everything I'd built." He pulled out a folder, slid it across the table. "This is VossTech's actual financial situation, not the version you've been showing the board. The real numbers. You have 6 months before total collapse. Maybe less." Clara opened the folder, her hands shaking. The numbers were worse than she'd thought. Much worse. "How did you—" "I've had access to every floor for 2 years, including the ones where people think janitors are invisible and say things they shouldn't." Another board member stood. "This is corporate espionage. We'll sue." "With what money?" Ethan asked calmly. "Your legal budget was cut last quarter, along with R&D, training, and employee wellness. You've been bleeding the company dry to maintain stock prices. I didn't need to spy. I just needed to listen." Clara sank into her chair. "What do you want?" "I want to save the 2,300 employees who work here. The ones you were about to lay off. The ones whose families depend on this company. I want to rebuild VossTech into something sustainable, something ethical, something I can be proud my daughter knows I'm part of." "And me?" Clara asked, her voice small. "That depends. Are you willing to learn, to change, to admit you've been wrong?" The question hung in the air. Around the table, board members exchanged glances. This wasn't a hostile takeover. It was something stranger. An intervention. Clara looked at Ethan for a long moment, really looked at him, not as a janitor, not as a threat, as a person who'd walked the same path she was on and somehow survived the fall. "I don't know how to do this differently," she admitted. "This is all I know. Be tough. Make hard choices. Don't show weakness. Then I'll teach you. The same way I learned, by losing everything and having to rebuild from the floor up, literally." He stood, preparing to leave. "I'm calling an all-staff meeting tomorrow at 9. You can either join me in announcing the changes, or you can resign. Your choice. But either way, things are changing." As he walked toward the door, Clara called out, "Why? Why not just fire me and take over completely?" He turned back. "Because you remind me of who I was, and someone gave me a second chance once. A 7-year-old girl who believed her daddy could fix his mistakes. I'm just paying that forward." After he left, the boardroom erupted in arguments. But Clara sat silent, staring at the financial report, seeing her company, her leadership, her choices laid bare in undeniable numbers. She'd been so sure she was succeeding, so convinced she was strong, but she'd just been a different version of the same failure Ethan Ward had been 3 years ago. The question was, could she be a different version of his redemption too? A receptionist later recounted, the entire floor stood and applauded, not because of money, but because they'd just witnessed justice. An emergency meeting took place. Clara faced Ethan in the glass room. "Who are you?" "Ethan Ward, the person you called just a janitor." "Why did you do this?" "Because I need to save the people you're about to fire." "You want revenge?" He shook his head. "No, I want to prove that kindness still has value in the world you call reality." She choked up. "You're the new owner?" "Temporarily, but I'm not planning to replace you. I just want to rebuild together." She fell silent, then burst into tears. "I was wrong. I used to think only money could keep power. No, only dignity can." He stepped forward, placing a contract on the table. "If you truly want to change, I'll return 49% of shares. I'll keep 51% to ensure you don't forget who really runs this company. The floor cleaners, drivers, night shift workers." She trembled, asking, "Why don't you hate me?" "Because my daughter said, 'Daddy, people only laugh when they forget how much they once hurt.'" Clara looked at him, tears streaming down. "Can you teach me how to be a real person? Just start with a real apology." But the lesson Clara needed to learn went deeper than a simple apology. The all-staff meeting the next morning was packed. Every employee, from executives to maintenance crew, filled the auditorium. Rumors had spread overnight. The janitor was the new owner. The CEO had been dethroned. The company was saved or doomed, depending on who you asked. Ethan stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces. He saw fear, hope, confusion, anger. All the emotions he'd felt 3 years ago when his own company had collapsed. "My name is Ethan Ward," he began. "Some of you know me as the janitor who's been here for 2 years. Some of you just found out I'm now the majority shareholder of this company. What most of you don't know is that I'm also the former CEO of Ward Technologies, the company that VossTech acquired 3 years ago." A murmur ran through the crowd. "When my company failed, I lost everything. My business, my marriage, my reputation. 230 people lost their jobs because of my failures. Some of them never recovered. One of them died." His voice cracked slightly. Lily, sitting in the front row with his assistant, reached out and squeezed his hand. "I came here planning revenge. I wanted to destroy VossTech the way it had profited from my destruction. But something changed. I started actually seeing the people who work here. The single moms working night shifts. The immigrants sending money home to their families. The young people just starting their careers. People who had nothing to do with what happened to me, but who would suffer if I acted out of spite." He paused, looking directly at Clara, who sat off to the side, her face pale. "Your CEO, Clara Voss, has made mistakes. She's prioritized profits over people. She's been cold and dismissive. She's made choices that hurt employees, but you know what? So did I. And I had to lose everything to learn. I don't want her to have to lose everything, because that means you all lose too. Clara stood slowly, walking to the podium. Ethan stepped aside. He's right, she said, her voice shaking. I've been a terrible leader. I've treated you like numbers instead of people. I've made you feel invisible and unvalued. I've created a culture of fear instead of respect. She looked out at the crowd, many of whom she'd never really seen before. I'm sorry, I'm deeply, truly sorry, and I know apologies aren't enough. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm stepping down as CEO. Gasps rippled through the room. I'm taking a position as Community Relations Advisor. I'll be working directly with Mr. Ward to restructure this company from the ground up, starting with listening to every single one of you about what needs to change. One employee, a woman from accounting, raised her hand. Why should we trust either of you? You failed once, Mr. Ward, and Ms. Voss has been failing us for years. It was a fair question. Ethan respected her for asking it. You shouldn't trust us, he said. Not yet. Trust is earned, so we're going to earn it every day, one decision at a time, starting with this: no layoffs. Everyone keeps their job. We're going to cut executive compensation instead, starting with mine and Ms. Voss's. Another hand, a young man from IT. What about the technology division that was sold last week? Ethan smiled. I bought it, under a different company name. It'll be merged back into VossTech within 60 days. No one loses their position. The mood in the room began to shift, from fear to cautious hope. A woman from the janitorial staff stood. Mr. Ward, you worked alongside us for 2 years. You mopped floors. You cleaned toilets. Why? Because I needed to remember what it felt like to be at the bottom, to be invisible, to have people walk past you like you don't exist. I needed to understand this company from the ground up, literally, and I needed to humble myself enough to deserve a second chance. Clara stepped forward again. I'm going to spend the next year working in every department of this company, 1 month at a time, starting with janitorial. I'm going to learn what each of you does, what challenges you face, what this company looks like from your perspective. Because I've been so far removed, I forgot that all of you are the reason this company exists at all. The room was silent. Then from the back, someone started clapping, then another. Then the whole room erupted in applause. Not because everything was fixed, but because for the first time in years, employees felt seen, heard, valued. Real person marker. An employee recorded the moment Clara walked out of the boardroom and bowed her head, saying in front of the entire company, I'm sorry for forgetting that every person deserves respect. After the meeting, Clara resigned as CEO and requested to work as a community consultant for Ward Holdings. Ethan allowed her to manage the Human Hands Fund for lower-tier employees. 1 year later, the company recovered spectacularly. At the anniversary ceremony, Clara spoke, A janitor taught me a lesson that Harvard didn't. Respect is the foundation of all success. Ethan stood in the back row, smiling. Lily ran up with a bouquet of flowers. Daddy, give these to the CEO lady. Clara knelt down, hugging the little girl. Thank you, sweetheart. Do you know? Your father taught the whole world today about kindness. But the transformation wasn't instantaneous or easy. It was messy, complicated, full of setbacks. Clara's first month working in janitorial was humbling in ways she couldn't have predicted. Her hands blistered from mopping. Her back ached from bending over toilets. She heard what employees really said when they thought no one important was listening. She'll never last. This is just PR. She doesn't actually care. And maybe they were right to be skeptical. Clara had been cruel, dismissive, had made their lives harder with every policy decision focused on cutting costs rather than supporting people. But she kept showing up, day after day, mopping floors beside the people she'd once looked through, eating lunch in the break room instead of her executive suite, learning names, hearing stories, understanding lives. One evening, a woman named Rosa, who'd been cleaning VossTech offices for 12 years, asked her, "Why are you really doing this? You're rich. You don't need this job." Clara thought about lying, about giving the PR answer. But Ethan had taught her that real change required real honesty. Because I was drowning in my own success. and didn't know it. I'd achieved everything I thought I wanted, but I'd lost something essential: my humanity, my ability to see other people as real. This work, it's teaching me to be human again. Rosa had nodded slowly. Okay, I'll accept that. But you've got a long way to go, Mia. A lot of people to make amends to. I know. I have a list. Literally. Everyone I hurt. I'm working through it. Over the months, Clara did work through that list. She visited the families of employees she'd laid off in previous years. She couldn't give them their jobs back, most had moved on. But she apologized, offered references, made donations to help with medical bills or education costs they'd struggled with after losing employment. Some people slammed doors in her face. Some cursed her out, some cried, some forgave her. She accepted all of it. Every reaction, every emotion, because she'd earned it. Ethan watched this transformation with a mixture of satisfaction and surprise. He'd expected Clara to quit after a week, to find the manual labor too degrading, to decide humility wasn't worth the cost, but she'd stuck with it, really stuck with it. And gradually, the company culture began to shift. Employees started speaking up more in meetings, suggesting improvements, taking ownership, because they finally believed their voices mattered. Profits didn't immediately skyrocket, but stability returned, trust rebuilt. And with trust came innovation, efficiency, and gradual growth. 1 year after the takeover, VossTech was profitable again, not because they'd cut their way to success, but because they'd invested in people, and people had invested back. At the anniversary celebration, Clara gave her speech. But the moment that mattered most came after, when she approached Ethan privately. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For seeing past who I was, for believing I could be better, for giving me a chance I didn't deserve. You deserved it. Everyone deserves a chance to grow. I just provided the space. Well, I'm grateful. And I want you to know I'm not going back to who I was. I can't. I've seen too much, felt too much. I know what it's like to be invisible now, and I'll never forget." Good, because that's what leadership actually is. Remembering what it felt like to struggle, and making sure others don't have to struggle alone. From this day forward, I choose to look at each other a little longer. I will live with kindness. A few months later, Clara visited Ethan's small workshop, where he taught orphans mechanical skills. "You still mop floors?" He smiled. "Yeah, clean the dust so you can see clearly who you are." She sat down, saying softly, "If someday you need someone to mop with you, call me." He laughed. "This job doesn't require an MBA, she replied. "Just a heart." Lily brought over a card with a drawing of a mop turned into a sword, writing, "Hero with a mop." Ethan looked at it, smiling. Maybe that's accurate. But the real ending came not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments. 2 years after the takeover, VossTech wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And more importantly, it was different. The company had implemented profit sharing. All employees, from executives to maintenance, received bonuses when the company succeeded. Not token amounts, real percentages that changed lives. They'd created pathways for advancement. Janitors could train to become technicians. Technicians could become engineers. Education was subsidized. Childcare was provided on site. Mental health resources were available to everyone. And Clara, who'd once been the cold CEO who valued profits over people, was now the person employees approached with problems. The one who listened, the one who advocated, the one who remembered what it felt like to be powerless. On the second anniversary of Ethan's takeover, the company held a different kind of celebration, not in a fancy hotel, in the parking lot, with food trucks and music and employees' families invited. Ethan and Lily set up a booth teaching kids how to build simple machines. Clara worked the grill, flipping burgers alongside the cafeteria staff. A reporter approached, wanting an interview about the miraculous turnaround. "What's the secret?" she asked. "How did you save this company?" Ethan thought about it. "We stopped seeing employees as costs to be minimized. We started seeing them as people to be invested in. Turns out when you treat people with dignity, they do remarkable things." And you, Ms. Voss? The reporter turned to Clara. How does it feel to be demoted from CEO to, what's your current title? Chief People Officer, Clara said. And it doesn't feel like a demotion. It feels like a promotion to something that matters. As sunset painted the sky orange and pink, Lily pulled both Ethan and Clara onto the makeshift dance floor. Employees and their families filled the parking lot, celebrating not just company success, but community, belonging, being seen. Daddy, Lily said, spinning between them, is this what you meant when you said you were building something better? Yeah, baby girl, this is exactly what I meant. Clara looked around at the faces, the laughter, the joy, and felt tears in her eyes. Not sad tears, grateful tears. She'd lost her CEO title, her corner office, her sense of superiority, and she'd gained something infinitely more valuable: purpose, connection, humanity. The janitor who'd bought her company hadn't destroyed her. He'd saved her from herself, from a life of success without meaning, from becoming so powerful she forgot how to be good. Thank you, she whispered to Ethan, knowing he'd hear her over the music. He nodded, understanding. Thank you for being brave enough to change. And as they stood there, watching employees dance with their families under string lights in a parking lot, both of them knew this was what success really looked like. Not profit margins, not stock prices, not executive titles, just people, taking care of people, building something worth being part of. The janitor with the mop had cleaned away all the bullshit and revealed something true. That kindness, dignity, and respect weren't weaknesses in business. They were the only things that made business worth doing at all. If you believe stories of healing like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe. We tell stories that should never be forgotten.